We're going to start in a couple of minutes, so grab your last sandwich or whatever you are eating or want to eat. Okay, I think we're going to begin. My name is Matt Burrows. I'm the Director of Foresight Strategy and Risk Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. And it's my pleasure to host today a session on the question that is on everybody's mind, and it's what's next after Trump's first 100 days. So we're at day 102. And we've already, I think, had a lot of interesting things happen during the first 101 days. Trump has taken a harder stance against immigrants coming into the U.S. on trade with allies and partners in Asia, Europe, and North America. He's also taken a stronger rhetorical stance. And obviously he also launched his first military attack in Syria against Assad's use of chemical weapons. He has run into a bit of trouble with his domestic agenda and continues to be plagued by accusations of his team's close ties with Russia. And in addition, many government positions remain unfilled without any signal that nominees are coming. But the global environment Trump has walked into is as tough as it has ever been for the U.S. Power is diffusing away from the U.S. to the east and south. There's discord in the Western world between so-called globalists and so-called populists. And in the U.S., there's an intense division between political, racial, and ethnic lines, rarely seen at this as so intense as it is now. It's obviously unfair to grade any president this early into his tenure, but I think we can begin talking about it, as everybody already is. And we have today an incredible group of panelists that our moderator, John Hudson, a foreign policy reporter at BuzzFeed News, will soon lead in the discussion. Before I turn the floor over to John and his panel, please note that we are live tweeting this event with @AC Scowcroft account using the Trump 100 Days hashtag. We hope you in the room and in the audience follow along, and please note that this event is on the record and is being filmed by C-SPAN. With that, my sincerest thanks to the panelists for coming together. Look forward to hearing what everybody has to say. We'll allow some time for questions at the end. We have a short video on the first 100 days, which we'll show first, and then the panelists will follow. So thanks, and let's get started.
America first.
Protests, outrage, and backlash from President Trump's refugee ban.
Immigration rate.
Flynn has resigned.
Therefore, I have recused myself.
We've just fired 59 missiles to Iraq.
To Syria.
Yes, heading toward Syria.
There is an FBI investigation underway
into the Trump campaign's possible ties to Russia.
North Korea is a big world problem. Putting an end to the war on coal.
Our allies are not paying their fair share.
Happy to have Aya
I said
back
it was
home.
obsolete. It's no longer obsolete.
Well, that was terrific production value there. Thank you for the introduction. I'm John Hudson, Foreign Affairs Correspondent with BuzzFeed News. Delighted to be here to talk about Trump's first 100 days with this distinguished panel. It sounds like we need a little more volume. Is that all right? Can you hear me? Does that work? Okay. Joining me today is John Negroponte, former Director of National Intelligence and U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Iraq, and the United Nations. Ellen Tauscher, the Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center, a former member of Congress and a former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security Affairs. And Manuel Muniz, a Director at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and a scholar of transatlantic relations. In preparation for this topic, I was talking to Senator John McCain last week about his views on the first 100 days. And he was very upbeat in saying that he couldn't pick a better team of national security advisors himself. He was delighted by the Syria strikes and the tougher line with Russia. And obviously, as someone who has been heavily critical of this administration, it was a bit of a turnaround. Except, really, John McCain's not the one who changed his views. It's this administration which went from saying China is a currency manipulator to it's not. NATO is obsolete, and it's not. And we're not at war with the Syrian government, and then we're shooting cruise missiles at the Syrian government. So my question is to John first. Has the Republican Party establishment finally captured the Trump administration? And as a card-carrying member of the Blob, how are you celebrating that capture?
I don't know whether the Republican Party has captured him or not. I think reality has captured him, and it captures him progressively more and more so every day. I think this is part of the learning curve of the presidency. I've noted in past presidencies, not unsimilar phenomena. People come into office with their own notions of what they're going to accomplish, what they're going to deal with, and then those views get tempered by reality. They also get tempered, and I think this is important in the case of Mr. Trump, particularly important, by their encounters and their meetings and discussions and conversations with their peers on the international scene. Prior to this, he hadn't had discussions with Xi Jinping or leaders of the different continents, and now he has such conversations practically every day. And if you look at his calendar, in the coming weeks and months, he's going to have a very heavy travel schedule, and I promise you that that's going to lead to an even more informed foreign policy going forward.
I mean, what about the extra latitude he seems to be given to the Pentagon? It seems like the Defense Department has much wider latitude to prosecute the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially with the Moab. For people who are concerned about civilian oversight and control of the Pentagon, is that something to be concerned about, or is this something that you're actually welcoming?
I'm not sure I know what you mean by extra latitude. We don't have expeditionary forces in either Iraq or Afghanistan at the moment. We're talking about a very modest presence, 5, 8, 9, 10,000 troops. I think we should have those residual forces there. I think they bolster confidence in those localities in the relationship with the United States, and I think it's essentially a good thing. Talk about latitude. April 17th, 1961, which is less than 100 days into his office, John F. Kennedy conducted the Bay of Pigs invasion. How's that for a foreign policy success?
Ellen, how are you looking at the first 100 days, and especially when it comes to the White House's relationship or maybe hands-off approach to the Pentagon?
I'm trying to avoid it. I know. I think I think many of us were shocked by what happened on November 8th. And then after we got out of bed, we decided that we were going to try to do our best to be optimistic. And then I think we got our hearts broken, as the administration came in, that it was so obvious that the administration had done very little planning, really had not the binders of people that other people had to get cabinet people nominated. Very little paperwork had been done. And then, for me, the ethics issues, I had expected that the enormity of being president and the idea of actually taking on the mantle of being the leader of the free world would sober up Mr. Trump, and that he would begin to do the things that we just generally expected, that he would divest himself of his assets, that he would create a blind trust, a truly blind trust that had cash in it with an independent manager, and that his family ties, to the extent that there were family members running Trump empire, that they would really be off to the side and really not in the White House or in the West Wing. And from that moment on, I think many of us just had to market every day with a very new reality of how this was not going to be any kind of conventional president, that the unconventionality of Donald Trump as a candidate was going to now continue into the White House, and that there were things that we had gotten to expect over time from different administrations, Democrat and Republican, a symmetry in a way things started to look that we weren't going to see. And from the national security perspective, I can say that he did make a good decision in picking General Mattis. And I think that his second choice for National Security Advisor is a very good choice. But the fact that most of the buildings in the government, the State Department, for example, looks like a neutron bomb hit it because the building's still there, but there are no people in it. It gives you pause. How are they actually going to get anything done? Mm-hmm. And my old spot T, doesn't have anybody really there. And how can you not have people there? We have some of the best people in the world on WMD and other issues when you've got an issue like North Korea simmering. And you'd think somebody would say, go find those people. I need them in the Situation Room right now. Mm-hmm. But I just don't think that there's any regular order going on.
Mm-hmm. And when you don't have people at the undersecretary position of nonproliferation, the undersecretary where you were at the State Department, how does that affect an administration? How does that have any impact on the interagency process? I mean, obviously, you point to the issue of North Korea, which is the most salient challenge that the president is probably facing right now. What sort of role would your former office be playing in the interagency process that, as we know, it's filled with acting people who are not political appointees and don't traditionally have as much sway in the interagency process? But what effect does that have? Doesn't the White House have smart people that can handle it?
No. No, they don't. So I think the issue really is, I think that Donald Trump is really is a CEO. He's a corporatized CEO. Now he has a family business. It's not like it's a public company. So he was really obviated from the responsibilities of transparency and visibility. But he has a corporate view of things. Everything's about the deal, about a good deal. There are winners and losers. And I think what he missed someplace along the line is the government isn't a business. It'd be nice to think that it was just about, I hear this from business people all the time, shouldn't we just add some more better business principles? Wouldn't it be nice if you ran it like business? It's not a business. There's a lot of things about it that you want to have, honesty, and you want things to go along the right way, but you certainly don't have the same responsibilities. It's a lot easier to be in business. In business, it's about the bottom line. It's about making money. It's about making deals. It's about having your product sell and having more money at the end of the year. That's not what the business of the government is. It's nice to have fiscal responsibility and all those things, but how many times, those of you that are Foreign Service professionals, and that have been in the government, how many times did you know where the good deal was and know you couldn't take it because you had an ally or an adversary for one reason or another that caused you to change the shape of the outcome? That's why it's a little harder to be in government. And I think, during those days, early on, when President Trump was outsourcing the North Korea problem to the Chinese, which was until about a week ago, he really didn't need anybody in T. He was doing what CEOs do. We've had a leak in the building, we're going to call Service Pro, and they're going to come in and clean it. I'm not cleaning it. I'm going to outsource this problem to somebody else. Well, the Chinese are doing what the Chinese have done through 3 or 4 administrations. They're kind of doing it, but not really, and they're not getting the outcome that we're worried about. They're not denuclearizing the peninsula, so now we've got to do something. So now you see people in the State Department or Tillerson, depending on who it is, saying things like, well, we have to start to talk to our allies. What about the Republic of Korea? What about Japan? And that's the party line. That's what we have been saying in successive Democratic and Republican administrations for a very long time. So we're getting back to where we were. So I think that there's a little bit of Donald Trump's point of view of the way he's always done things, because he is a 70-year-old guy. People kind of do the things that they tend to do. And I think now he's course correcting, not necessarily because he wants to, but because it's the way things have to be. And so you need people in the State Department now. If you're going to actually engage with allies, then you do need people in T that are going to talk to their counterparts in Asia and around the world about these issues. And you need people with expertise that know what happened in '94, why that deal didn't work out, about the different mechanisms that you need. And so I think they're going to find themselves, I don't believe that they want to fill these jobs, but I think that they're going to have to start to depend on the people that have been in these jobs for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to engaging with allies, I wanted to bring up the NATO front and to bring you into this, Manuel. I was curious at the start of this administration if there was going to be a really prolonged campaign of criticizing U.S. NATO allies and really trying to shake some money out of them in an aggressive manner. But I think that as we've seen, the president's key deputies, Tillerson, Mattis, Pence, in trips to Bonn and Brussels, have really been on this team reassurance. And I don't personally think that they have been messengers of the Trump line that this cannot continue any longer, at least to the level of severity that Trump communicates it. So do you think that in any way those cabinet members undermined his efforts? And what is your sense from your recent travels to Europe of what impressions he's leaving behind and what they're understanding from this administration's message on NATO?
So we had the same situation at the Munich Security Conference. It was very clear. It's a little bit schizophrenic. You have the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense saying NATO is still vital, we support NATO, but of course you've had tweets from the President that were maybe 2 weeks old saying exactly the opposite. Everybody took questions. I remember this. Everybody took questions at Munich except the U.S. reps. So they went on stage, spoke, and then they left. Of course, the first question would have been, how does this match? How does this? For me, the issue, at least the way I see this, is sort of like an agency structure issue. You mentioned the blob, but how much will the structure weigh on Trump? And by the structure, I mean the many layers within the system, including his cabinet, the judiciary, his own party and Congress, the Fed. By the way, I think there are going to be issues with the Fed and monetary policy further down the line, because he's going to be interested in very lax monetary policy, in part to lower the currency, but there are going to be tensions there with inflation and others. So how does that structure weigh on him? I think it's going to weigh like a ton of bricks. I'm a structuralist, so I think that he's going to be constrained on a number of fronts, and he has. I have a long list of things here that he hasn't been able to do, from the travel ban to lots of things. NATO, I think, is part of that issue. He's had a lot of people come in and advise him on NATO, and they've really moderated their positions on NATO. Not so much on the spending targets, but most of us agreed on the spending targets in any case. So including people from Europe. So I don't think there's been a major shift there. What I'm very worried about, and this is something we were discussing as well before, is irrespective of what has happened in the first 100 days and what happens after, what I think is very interesting is the trends that put him here why people voted for him in the first place and why people are voting for very radical options in Europe, I think the trends are still there. And the broader question is he going to be able to address the underlying issues and the causes that put him there? And that led to a lot of political radicalization. And there, I think that the answer is probably no. And some of the policies that we've seen will probably make the issues worse. And I have some data that I brought to show you guys. I don't know if it's a good idea to show it with the audience.
Yeah, please.
But so if we're starting to understand a lot better what has been feeding this populist revolt, and at least my thesis here is that this is produced by the impact of tech on the way income is produced, generated, and distributed in our societies, much more than trade, much more than immigration. I mean, if you look, we're starting to have a lot of data on this, and it's actually very, very compelling. So I brought some slides with me. This shows what happened to industrial output in the U.S. So there's been a lot of job destruction in some of these sectors, and not just job destruction, but also an increase in job precariousness, and this is something that tends to be left out of the debate. So it's not just unemployment, but also underemployment, subemployment. So there's this new economic class, which you can term the precariat, that includes not just the unemployed, but a lot of people that have either lost their jobs or suffered the downward pressure that technology puts on some jobs. This is what happened to industrial output and jobs in the US from the 1980s to today. So the blue line is output. Output has increased by about 250%. So the US has reindustrialized in terms of output. The red line shows you employment, which has almost halved. This graph, by the way, shows you why Trump is probably going to fail on his promise to bring back industrial jobs. He might accelerate the return of industrial production, but not jobs. The bars, by the way, show you the number of American workers you need for $1 million of output in industry. So you needed about 25 Americans in 1980. You need about 6.4 Americans today. So huge explosion in productivity, right? Collapse in employment. This is now, by the way, happening in services as well. So there's a lot of jobs that are being automated in services. The estimates are in the transportation sector, maybe 3 million jobs due to self-driving cars. But the estimates that are out there are about 50% of current jobs in risk of automation in the next 20 years. This is producing this. To me, this really changed the way I think about this issue entirely. It looks like a very boring graph, but it's actually quite fascinating. This is US data, and it shows from 1973 onwards, we've had a big decoupling of productivity and hourly wages. So some of us have termed this a breach of our social contract, because if you just simplify our growth model to the maximum, essentially we believe that through increases in productivity that ended up trickling down, to use a loaded term, into salaries and feeding a middle class, right? That has ceased to happen in the United States since the 1970s. So we have found a way, my thesis is of course through technology, to increase productivity without creating jobs or paying better for the jobs we have, right? So I think this is what's behind this, the troubles that we're currently living. And I'll just give you a couple of pieces of data more, and then we can go back to the panel. But that decoupling is producing some incredibly disturbing dynamics within the US. This is data from Raj Chetty, who's a researcher at Stanford. He was at Harvard before. And he was given access to a huge tax database in the United States going back to the 40s. And what he did, anonymized, what he did with that database was he calculated the probability of an American born in one of these generations earning more than his or her parents throughout his or her lifetime. And the probability keeps on collapsing. So for millennials, it's a little bit under 50%. So this is sort of the death of the American dream of socioeconomic mobility, intergenerational mobility, right? So this is stagnation. One of the consequences of that decoupling is this, right? And the other is a huge increase in inequality. This is data, also very recent data, and that's the pre-tax income going to the top 1% of income earners and the bottom 50% in the US. So as you can see, in the 70s, you get this big change in that trend, and today the top 1% is earning a lot more of the pre-tax income in the United States than the bottom 50%, right? So my whole thesis, and I was wondering if we could play this short clip. It's like a 50-second clip. I wonder if we could play that for you to see, because it summarizes how I think this plays out politically. It's not working. That's fine. Don't worry about it.
If we get it working,
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting point in the sense of a lot of this, these macro trends that you just discussed are obviously going to be stubborn and extremely difficult for the president to overcome. But one of the things that the president is maybe better at than any politician right now is salesmanship. And you could see this when he was rolling out the carrier announcement that they, saved hundreds of jobs. A lot of people were remarking at the time that that was a better salesmanship job than whatever happened during the TARP, which is continually, viewed upon as something that didn't succeed in any sort of way, in polling. Ellen, as a seasoned politician, someone who has, survived her own congressional campaigns, is this something that the president might be able to overcome through his proven ability to connect with voters who are suffering from exactly those trends that Manuel just pointed out?
Look, the president's got a big problem on credibility. He does not speak the truth on a regular basis. And it's going to start to catch up with him. Telling people in West Virginia that he's going to bring coal mining jobs back is a terrible lie to tell to people that are not only suffering from black lung and have a very depressed economy, but it's a lie. And telling people that, making claims that he has made, I find it to be stunning that there were people that actually went along, but eventually your mother was right. You're going to have to square yourself with the facts eventually. And right now he's in trouble with promises that he made a big deal about the 100 days himself. These are the things he was going to do. He had a compact for the 100 days, and he's got one thing done, and it was for that part of the Republican Party and for the Federalist Society, having Neil Gorsuch go through that process was a victory. I'm not too sure the Senate is ever going to be the same with the elimination of the filibuster. But, I think, and cloture, but I think the whole question is, what does he start to do that resonates with his own base? He's got all kinds of problems with people that didn't vote with him. He's done nothing to unite the country. He's been a very divisive person. If you saw his speech on Saturday night, it was almost as bad as his inauguration speech, was pretty divisive. So, I think something's going to have to happen where he decides that he is the president and the mantle of power has fallen on his shoulders, and now he has to start to change the way he's been doing things and start to be more accountable for the claims he's making and start delivering on the promises that he's made. Because eventually there is no running from the fact that the House is up in 18, the entire House. And my former Republican colleagues that have to run are now trying to figure out how they live in a world where Trump has so much influence, but they go home and they get battered about the head every weekend. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They're going to probably pass a horrible replacement for the Affordable Care Act that has no hope of passing the Senate. Instead of moving to the middle and getting Charlie Dent and other moderate Republicans, and even perhaps working with Nancy Pelosi to get the reforms on the Affordable Care Act that was needed, and getting something that actually would help people keep their insurance and make sure that people were not going to get run out of town on the insurance issue. He moved to the far right with Rand Paul and the Freedom Caucus, and they're going to have a waiver in this bill called the MacArthur waiver that is going to allow states to waive the whole idea of pre-existing condition insurance, making it, a necessity. That's just going to devastate the insurance market. And, I think that he's going to have he's going to pass it, maybe, he still doesn't have the votes. But the Senate's never going to pick it up because they're not going to be able to pass that bill. And so so the House Republicans they're the canaries in the coal mine right now. They're up, their majority is at risk. They're going to have very little of the promises that he made to deliver. And that's where you start to see the compact between the Republicans start to shred, and it starts to shred about August of next year.
Oh, and when it comes to making good on promises, we've seen in the last week the president's desire to renegotiate NAFTA. And John, just given your experience as ambassador to Mexico, I'm really interested in your assessment of the state of U.S.-Mexico relations. How much chance do you think the president has of getting some sort of renegotiation of NAFTA that can be agreed upon between among the three countries? And how is this going to affect our relations with our southern neighbor?
Yeah, let me just say first, I think that a lot of these issues that he has raised, you really sort of see the whole system of checks and balances in this country very much at work, not only between the branches of government, where you see that happening, but also with the media. And now, more and more, also, he has to contend with reactions from foreign countries, which I think he's going to take more into account going forward. And just one other point before going to Mexico, on this question of the promises, I think he has a kind of interesting way with promises. All right. He's going to revive coal industry jobs, isn't he? And no, but that's what he said, right? But I watched on TV this morning, if I'm not mistaken, they've agreed on some provision in this new budget agreement
For the health care.
on full health care benefits
Right.
for all coal miners and their families. And I
Right.
can visualize him saying, well, I've delivered on my promise to the coal industry, or at least delivered in some kind of important way. So, these arguments sometimes are a matter of interpretation. On Mexico, NAFTA bashing was, of course, very much a part of the campaign. And I think the word NAFTA has been very unpopular, since a time that very much predates President Trump. And so I think he parlayed that into a very strong campaign theme. I think when they came on board, I think there was a recognition that developed, and I think it's very much developed now, that the supply chain interrelationships with Mexico, the whole network of interconnections between our three economies, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, is much more heightened than it was at first. And so I think they realized here's a country with whom we have a $500 billion a year trade relationship, 10 times the level we have with Russia, 10 times, oh, by the way, the level that we have with the United Kingdom, which we treat with such deference. And I think there's a realization has set in that, gee, this is really serious business and we better be careful. So you asked me, what are the chances? I think the way forward on the NAFTA really is to try to take some of the elements, not all, but some of the elements that were negotiated in the TPP, which he withdrew from his very first day in office, and try to incorporate them into some kind of new NAFTA agreement. There's the whole question of digital economy. There's a question of updating intellectual property. There are other features of a potential free trade agreement between the three North American countries that I think are possible. And the last thing I'd say, which we've heard mentioned occasionally from the White House, is, oh, gee, we could make North America an important sort of economic platform from which we can compete with the rest of the world. Let's make it some kind of a powerhouse. You hear that talks sort of a little more often now than you did before. So I think it's going to turn out all right. I think for Mexico, I think they're willing to suffer, if you will, the indignity of the wall and some of the ethnic slurs, which I personally believe were very inappropriate throughout the campaign, but only if the economic part turns out all right. If it doesn't, then we run the risk of losing the benefits of all the work we did for the past 25 years to bring Mexico politically closer to the United States, especially since 9/11, since which time the cooperation on security matters has been absolutely excellent. I don't think we want to go back to a relationship of quote-unquote distant neighbors, as Alan Riding, the New York Times correspondent, wrote in his noted book some 25, 30 years ago. And the irony of returning to a distant neighbor relationship because of actions taken by the United States, not Mexico, would it be even greater?
But this is where Donald Trump's bravado and hubris clashes and crashes with reality. Make America great again, and America first. If I knew that was your posture, and I had a contract with you, and you said, and I came to you and said, I want to renegotiate our deal, do you think that that's going to be a deal where I have any fairness or I have any chance of reaching a parity? And that's why this is, I think that President Trump still needs to take a lesson in the differences between government and business. I don't know why anybody would sit down from Canada or Mexico and be willing to renegotiate a deal when I'm telling you, I don't think I got more than I should, which is what I want. I want to have superiority here. I want to do better than you. I want to be first.
But didn't you read The Art of the Deal? That's how you set the negotiation terms. You front load those demands. It's a best-selling book.
Well, these Mexican, by the way, these Mexican economic negotiators are very sharp people, and every one of them has a PhD from Harvard, Yale, MIT, Chicago. They've been brilliant ever from Salinas on down, and they continue to be so. They're really a very impressive group of people.
Is there something that the Trump administration might succeed in extracting from the Mexicans in any sort of deal that you think is in the realm of the possible and maybe should be even shooting for from a purely nationalist perspective?
Well, I don't know for sure because some of this is pretty darn technical, but I suspect maybe some things on rules of origin regarding in the automobile sector, for example, to ensure that more U.S. parts and so forth, more U.S. content. But it's already the case that Mexico, which imports they export about $300 billion or 200 and something billion dollars worth of products to us. 40% of the content is American already, as opposed to 5% from China. So we have fundamentally favorable trading conditions with the country of Mexico. Mm-hmm. They can be tweaked, but I don't think they can be overhauled.
Yeah, I want to add a thought on this, and I think that's why the sort of the broader analysis of why we're here is significant for this sort of thing, because the way all of these trends that I was showing before have played out politically is in two clear ways. One is pessimism about the future. It's fascinating. I mean, if you look at Trump voters, there was a Pew poll survey done before the election, about 2 weeks, and they were asked, is life for you or people like you better or worse than it was 50 years ago? And about 80% said it was worse. Hillary voters were sort of 18% thought it was worse. This is true in Europe as well. If you look at Le Pen voters and if you look at Syriza voters in Greece and others. The other is anti-elitism. So anti-elitism has played a huge important, very important role in Europe and the United States. If you look at Brexit voters and lack of trust in elites, whether it's academic elites, the Bank of England, very low, very negative sort of net levels of trust in these people. Now, why is this relevant? I think it's relevant to the discussion we're having about trade and others because the way the geopolitical consequence of all of this is a strong erosion of the liberal order, in large part because the liberal order is highly dependent on trust in elites, and this is the case for trade, it's the case for the EU. So I studied EU integration when I was doing my PhD in Europe, and we just don't have trade theories or integration theories in Europe, for example, that do not have elites right at the core of the theory. You need business, political elites that are aware of the benefits of these things and aware of the costs of disintegration or breaking up trade deals. And those people need to be able to have traction with their electorates and the people they're representing. So I think these dynamics that we're seeing are all derived from the severance of that trust with elites. So if the underlying trends continue, if more and more people fall into this category of the precariat, if that level of trust keeps on collapsing, I'm not sure who comes after Trump or something, but the politics will trump the economics. And I think the anti-elite and the loss of trust is essential. So I'm concerned that my key message is this is far more structural than we think. If we don't address the underlying issues, that entire architecture, whether it's regional integration, global trade, et cetera, in some instances, by the way, the capitalist regime itself, and we can have a discussion about this because the ultimate consequence of this has been anti-elitism and anti-establishment feeling, but also collapse of support for democracy as a system of government, which for me is the most serious consequence of all of this. And we can have a discussion about how that looks, but the latest World Value Survey data on this is also very worrying. So I think it's important to look at the details of what's happening now, what the administration is doing. But if you play this, if you do the long view on this, and if we don't address the underlying issue, I think global trade and other issues are very much at risk of being reversed. And we've seen this, by the way, in the early 20th century, but that's another discussion. But we've seen this happen previously in our history.
So if I could just give you a little vignette here, a little story. Ronald Reagan, I was Deputy National Security Advisor under the last couple of years of the Reagan administration, and there came a day in January, I think it was '88, that he had to sign virtually by video teleconference the U.S.-Canada FTA with Brian Mulroney. And General Powell and I went in every day at 9:30 in the morning to give the president his national security brief and his order of the day and all. And we said, well, today, Mr. President, you're going to be signing this FTA with Canada. And Colin, looking at me, said, John, why don't you just give the president a few words on the content of that agreement? The president cut me off. I barely said a word, and he cut me off. He said, you don't have to tell me about the benefits of free trade. I remember the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So my point would be, it's not only the lack of structure and process and all of that. This, up until now, has been a sort of an ahistorical administration.
Right.
Well, I think history's going to catch up with it pretty soon.
I'm also interested in your perspective as ambassador to the UN. Right now we're seeing an interesting dynamic where one of the most comfortable speakers and mouthpieces for this administration is Nikki Haley, who seems to be pushing the administration, or at least communicating a more hawkish, traditional Republican foreign policy when it comes to taking a hard line with Russia and potentially a maybe more expansive role for the United States in Syria. What do you make of the dynamic, and what happens when you have a ambassador to the UN who is more vocal than the Secretary of State?
Well, we've had a little bit of that. We've had some experiences like that in the past. Jeane Kirkpatrick is the person I think of at the beginning of the Reagan administration. What you've got to have, especially when the UN, our ambassador to the UN is a cabinet member, which I was not, by the way, and in most Republican administrations, the ambassador to the UN is not a member of the cabinet. And I can make the case for that at another time. But you have to have a deconfliction mechanism one way or another. You can't have the Secretary of State and the Ambassador to the United Nations saying widely divergent things. And the other is that ultimately the Secretary has got to be the principal spokesman of our foreign policy other than the President of the United States. That said, I think it's good that we have an energetic, bright, and capable, politically capable also, permanent representative of the United States to the United Nations. I think it's going to give relevance to the UN, and she herself is going to discover some of the real benefits that accrue to the United States from being a member of the United Nations, whether it's peacekeeping or the humanitarian agencies or whatever. And she's going to have sufficient voice to draw those benefits to the attention of her peers in the cabinet. So I take it as a plus that an important personality has been put as our representative to the UN.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And having it, at the United Nations, obviously North Korea has been, at the forefront. We've also, seen that important abstention from China at the UN Security Council. And maybe one of the most dramatic changes that we've seen so far in the 100 days is a posture that the Trump administration has taken of vilifying China and talking about how much of a problem China was. And suddenly to a post-Xi Mar-a-Lago engagement where the administration is increasingly touting how well it's working with China.
And it was I thought, quite amusing the way to the crowd in Pennsylvania on Saturday, he said, well, you don't think we should call them a currency manipulator when we need them for the Korea problem, do you? And they said, no. I mean, they all agreed with him very enthusiastically. So he's quite skillful. You got to give him credit.
And I mean, do you see these achievements at the council? Do you think that he maybe has succumbed to just the personality magnetism of Xi Jinping, or do you think he's playing a game that we're maybe not seeing? And obviously, we did see shipments of coal that have been turned back.
I come back to
from
my
North Korea.
earlier point that part of the checks and balances in this whole system is meeting with your peers on the international scene. I think he probably understands and knows more about these issues now than he did 100 days ago. And I think it's been sort of axiomatic ever since we've been focused on this issue for the past 20 plus years that China's got a role in this. Is it decisive? I don't think so. I think their role is exaggerated, and my Chinese counterparts over the years have told me, you attribute too much influence to us in the relationship with North Korea. That said, they are a very important part of this situation, as are Japan and South Korea and so forth, and Russia even, since they're a neighbor also, and they're well within range of all those nasty missiles that the North Koreans are developing. But this is going to require concerted diplomacy, and I think the key elements are going to be the United States, China, and ultimately, once we've set that table and decided what kind of outcome we want, and better that we reach that agreement mutually, then trying to find a way to influence North Korea to accept some kind of a negotiated outcome.
Ellen, you're a Democrat. It's clear that President Trump isn't your favorite president so far. But what is the best decision he's made on foreign policy outside the Mattis pick, you're clearly excited about? But if there's something that you could point to say, this is a position I'm not horrified about, what is it? And this is an administration that has taken all of the positions, so there's a lot to choose from.
It was the TLAMs into Syria. I mean, I think that not having us speak up about the use of chemical weapons was a mistake in the previous administration in a more demonstrable way, and I support the fact that he did that. The problem is now I still don't know what his policy is. And, I think the problem with the president is that this is a style problem and it's a temperance problem. He, to the roaring crowds of the Roman Forum of his campaign, he'll say anything to anybody about anybody to get an applause line. The problem is, now that he's president, he has to look a little like Gumby to kind of make that into what you have to do to rule and to be the president. And so, I think I'm not very different than most people. I think the whiplash I'm getting watching him go back and forth and trying to figure out why doesn't he understand we hear everything he's saying. And so when he is in Harrisburg saying things like, well, I'm only nice to the Chinese because I want them to take this problem of North Korea off my hands, and then I'm going to make some good deal for them because I get to do that. Well, I mean, I think the Chinese, as John is saying, are saying, look, I think you mistake what power we have. And by the way, we're not interested in working for you. Mm-hmm. That's not what we do. So if you're telling me that's what you want, that's definitely something I'm not doing for their own reasons. So I think that there's a shocking, dangerous naivete about how all this is done, and I think somebody has to make sure that this temperance issue starts to get. He needs to be in the middle lane. There's a reason why people don't always say what they're thinking and what they would like to say. Part of it is you don't want to be on the record for it. The second thing is, for a man that constantly talks about how he doesn't want to tip his hand, he's telegraphing to people, allies and adversaries, all day long, very mixed messages. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I think we've got to start to get him, kind of ruled in a lane where at least there isn't so much whiplash by allies. Mm-hmm.
And John, as a Republican and someone who signed one of those letters that happened before the election, a lot of those people who signed those letters have gone a little bit quiet lately, but you're obviously a very vocal, publicly available human being of Washington. What is the worst decision that this president has made since coming into office, something that you're most disappointed by?
Well, he did it on the first day, withdrawing from the TPP.
Right.
But let me just say, because to inject another region of the world into this, or to expand on the reference to Syria, I just came back from Abu Dhabi and Jeddah and Muscat, I mean, just last week, an 8-day trip. And, you talk about a part of the world where they're really happy that, and particularly in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, they are very happy that Mr. Trump is the president. They think the atmosphere has changed. They think they have all their list of concerns and complaints that they had about the previous administration, and they think that this administration is going to be tougher on Iran. I'm not saying I totally agree or disagree with what they've been saying, but there's a part of the world which is really genuinely, I found, comforted, particularly the Saudis, with the advent of Mr. Trump to office.
But isn't that because essentially the Trump administration has taken sides in this historical Sunni-Shia shift?
I don't think it's taking sides in I think they've taken geopolitical sides. They have concerns about the behavior of Iran that were not dealt with in the nuclear agreement because they were not part of the nuclear agreement, but the nuclear agreement was silent on the issue of support for Hezbollah and Hamas and for the extremism in Syria and in Iraq and elsewhere. And of course, now they're saddled with this, and particularly in Saudi, with this conflict with the Houthis in Yemen. Yeah. So, no, I think it's. I don't think it's only sectarian.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Can I
Yes,
can
please.
I add a note on Europe? So I think what the shift on NATO policy is quite promising. At least the language has really changed, and they're focusing on issues that I think are workable in the near future. What worries me, since a little bit before the Munich conference this year, is the discourse on the EU, support for Brexit, the soft endorsement of Marine Le Pen. I think these are really serious issues and that undermine U.S. interests in the region and an investment that the U.S. has made for 70 years in European integration. I think Brexit is going to be very hard to make a success out of Brexit. I can only see the destruction of value just across the board for both the remaining European Union members and for the UK. And I think actually the geopolitics of Brexit are going to be very perverse, and we're seeing them play out. So this is moving into a relative gains sort of scenario where everybody's trying to extract value from this. There's fights now. I think it took about 24 hours for the French Prime Minister to offer tax incentives to the city to move to Paris. Also, it took about 24 hours for the Spanish Foreign Minister to offer co-sovereignty to Gibraltar. It's been in the news lately, but I think other fronts are going to pop up. So the weakening of relations within Europe and of NATO allies that are now all within the EU, but one of them is leaving. I think this is a huge threat to European and U.S. interests, and I don't think the White House is aware of this. I think NATO has strong people defending it at the White House, at the Department of Defense and the National Security Council. I don't see a lot of people defending the EU. And I remember, and I'll just share an anecdote, when Theresa May was in Washington, she was asked a couple of times by Trump, who's next? And it was one of the first questions she got when she was here. And she said, well, I hope nobody. And everybody was surprised that the British Prime Minister would say something like that. But it also tells me that there are very few people defending the EU in the White House. I mean, if the rest of the EU depends on the British Prime Minister making the case for EU integration, then we're in trouble. And in Germany, and this speaks to John's point about the constraints and interacting with other leaders, apparently Angela Merkel was asked like 10 times whether the US could negotiate a trade deal with Germany. And that's, of course, not allowed within EU rules. We've delegated all of our trade competences to Brussels. And it was something like 10 or 11 times that she was asked, which is something that a lot of people predicted, that in the Bannon-Trump view of the world, things are very bilateral. Of course, it's much better for the US to try to deal bilaterally with countries in the EU, but it's illegal within EU norms. And after that conversation, apparently the White House is now convinced that TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is going to have to continue to be negotiated. So there's some shifts and some constraints there that are operating on their working. but the overall lack of support for EU integration and the not understanding the value of EU integration, not just in economic terms, in true hard geopolitical terms. If this unravels, we're back to power politics in Europe, and we're going to see this through Brexit, and it's a worrying development.
And hasn't there been a sort of softening on that position? I mean, so far it looks like the Trump administration just has, from time to time, flirtations with right-wing nationalists in Europe. Whether it's a tweet about Marine Le Pen or Nigel Farage making another surprise visit to a party and talking to some people in the White House and getting a photo op. But when journalists try to sit down the president and ask him about the EU, he said, "I love the EU." So it seems like maybe there has been an evolution on that. But your sense is that there's still like code red alarm. The United States doesn't support the European project, and the liberal order could crumble before us.
I don't see it. I mean, maybe you.
No,
have
I
a
have
better
a question. Did you say what did you say about the status of the TTIP negotiations? Did they say they would continue?
Yeah, I think they're ongoing. I mean, it's not like TPP or it's not like NAFTA. I mean,
so they're going to do it.
Well, apparently they're going to continue the conversations because, because they failed on Germany.
There's a silver lining there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Except the Europeans were always the problem with that ever going through.
But why are the Europeans a problem? And we go back to the anti-elitism and lack of trust. I mean, any of us, I can guarantee, maybe you know a lot more about international trade than I do. But even if I could read, even if I could read the text, right, I wouldn't have an informed opinion. I wouldn't know. So there's a level of trust and delegation that needs to be there for international trade to be sustainable. If you think the system is not working for you, then you're out in the streets of Bonn or Cologne or whatever protesting against this trade deal. I can assure you, none of the people that are protesting against this deal know the details of it. Even if it was fully, it's mostly public, but people were opposing TTIP even before we had negotiated it. So there's something there that has nothing to do with free trade, right? This is not an assessment of free trade. So we go back to the populist issue, the anti-elite, the lack of trust, all of these things. Right?
Well, if you're right, and the Trump administration is now supporting TTIP, we've got a great scoop here on our hands, and so you guys all made your time worthwhile for coming by. And it's a great thing to press the administration harder on to find out where they are on this issue. I think it's definitely important. Did you want to add, Ellen or John, anything?
I just wanted to say that I was a Democrat that voted for trade deals all the time, and not easy to do in California, but my congressional district supported trade deals, and I was able to continue to serve them. The question is, for the populist side of Donald Trump, where are the counterbalancing programs for trade deals? Where's the Trade Adjustment Authority and all of the things that were supposed to make it, free junior college or community college, the things that were portability of health care, the package that Democrats always pushed that the Republicans in the House and Senate, when they had Republican administrations, never wanted to go for. But these are the very programs that give people that are dislocated by globalism and international trade and tech a sense of how they can pick up and move out of manufacturing into a tech job or into something else, or a service economy job. Absolutely. Where are these programs? And you would expect the populist in Donald Trump should be pushing these things. You haven't heard a word about them, not word one. And so this is, once again, this is like the West Virginia problem or the Kentucky coal mining problem. These promises are going to, these things are going to continue to fail. Things are not going to materialize. And the very same people that went for Donald Trump because they feel disaffected, they feel as if their future isn't, wedded to where the elites want it to go, they're going to continue to be heartbroken, and then they're going to jump, and they're going to try to go someplace else.
Yes.
But the people that are up are the House of Representatives. That's the next election in 2018, and that's why the Republicans in the House, particularly, are on the front line here. And I think that it's going to be important for the rhetoric to catch up to what people's promises and expectations have been.
Mm-hmm. Can I add a quick thought on this? Yeah. And I totally agree. So if you look at, this is something that I think we need to be reminded of. The U.S. Returned to pre-crisis GDP levels in 2012. The UK in about 2014. So the U.S. elected a president on a platform to break the system at the moment when it was the richest it has ever been in aggregate output of goods and services, in GDP, etc. The UK did the same with Brexit. So we're failing at the management of prosperity, of abundance. And this is the issue with trade. Unless we deal with the people that are affected negatively, with the externalities of some of these things, including tech, we're going to get a backlash against these things that is going to be value destructive overall. So the system is extremely effective at generating prosperity. By the system, I mean the liberal order. I mean free trade, tech, entrepreneurship, innovation, peace, all of these things, international law. But we're just failing at the equity piece. And
Well, we're
that,
failing at the issues of training and education. It goes right to the charts that you showed us earlier. And I think there's some recognition of that, but we haven't quite figured out how to deal with it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we do have the building blocks of what Trade Adjustment Authority has been. We've had it for 25 years. And if it's funded, it actually works. We know you have to empower and educate people for lifelong learning, you know, to adjust their skills and mark them to the new market, and give them things that will port them into a new economy, whether it's healthcare or whether it's a loan to go to school, or even how to manage their mortgage. You know, if they find themselves dislocated, you know, you've got to give them things that, and a lot of them are on the state level, but the federal government has to fund a lot of these things. Well, they've never been funded to the extent they have. They've never kind of had a sustainability to the point that they need to be. Clearly, the people that would benefit from them don't think they're working. And this is a very simple message from a populist president, and he hasn't said a word about it.
And the education piece, just a quick comment, I think it's central. And the latest data that I've seen from, for example, from the European Commission, is there are over 2 million jobs in the EU that cannot be filled because companies cannot find people with the right skills. So you have places in Southern Europe with, you know, 2-digit levels of unemployment, and yet you have jobs that are not filled. So this is a failure of our skills gap that is huge. We don't know how, so the estimates are, you know, 50% of current jobs are going to be automated. We don't know exactly which new categories are going to emerge in the future, but we have a sense of where the world is headed. And, you know, there's data from the WEF about the categories that are emerging, and you need quantitative skills, social skills. The combination of those two have been increasing in demand in jobs. There's specific job categories. So we know which ones are being...
Data analytics.
Data analytics, Internet of Things, all of these things, creativity and quantitative skills. So there are things that can be done there. Now the question is, the Trump policy so far, so I look at the tax plan, it worries me, because what you have there is a huge collapse on taxes on capital, which, by the way, most people think that on top of the education, we're going to have to restructure taxation to some extent, because if capital is accruing so much of the income, you have to rebalance your taxation from labor income to capital income. So that's going down, right? So that's probably going to increase the issue, the problem of inequality and others. So some of the signals that we're getting, not just the silences, but also on the action side, it looks as if the diagnosis has not been done correctly. At least, of course, you know, this is my opinion. So I'm not sure if we're headed in the right direction in terms of policies, if this is the diagnosis.
Well, I want to kick it off to questions in the audience. Just one last, and I see that we have General Hayden back there. It would be great if he could throw out a few questions. Oh, he's saying no, don't call him. But just the final question to Ellen. You know, have Democrats gotten carried away on this issue of Trump's ties to Russia? Essentially, there's so much innuendo. There's a lot of smoke, and there's a lot of smoke that keeps surfacing. But there's also a lot of unanswered questions. And so,
is this to me or Mike Hayden?
This is to either one, but to you specifically. And is there any downside to having a constant drumbeat of Russia innuendo to a presidency, and in a way that might affect U.S.-Russia relations?
Look, I'd like to be able to put this to rest, wouldn't you? I'd like to know what the Russian influence in the 2016 election or previous elections have been. I would think everyone has an interest in this. This is
except the Russian.
The core. This is the core of our democracy, and you know, the intelligence, 16, 17 intelligence agencies got together and said that not only did the Russians influence the election, but they did so to the benefit of Donald Trump. Look, I don't know about you, but I don't think that Vladimir Putin got together with the GRU and said, look, I want you to influence the American election. I want it to benefit Donald Trump. and I don't care how it turns out. I don't think he said, I don't care how it turns out. I think he said, do it. And if he said so, how many people here were surprised about the outcome of the election? Oh, come on. You put both of your hands up. Everybody was. Even Donald Trump was surprised. So I don't know what happened, but I want to know. I want to know that we have integrity in our elections. It's a complicated thing. Most people don't understand national elections in this country are run by counties. It's a patchwork quilt. In a county, you can have 5 different ways of voting. Some of them highly susceptible to being influenced by wireless and servers and other things. I want to know what happened. I think everybody should have an interest in it. Apparently, no one in the Republican Party has an interest in it. Now, I suggest that we need an independent 9/11-like commission of experts that would actually, have a broad band of real experience, and they would find out what happened. But I want to know what happened. And so you're right. I don't like the idea that there's an overhang of it, but I also don't like the idea that no one in one party that benefited from this, because not only did we not expect Donald Trump to be president, we didn't expect Mitch McConnell to be the majority leader. So there's a lot of people with a lot of interest and worry about their election being delegitimatized who have the power to stop us from getting to the bottom of this. And I think that the American people should pitch a big fit and say, I want to know what happened. Bless you. And I want to know credibly. I want to know credibly, and I want to know now, because we have elections in 18 and 20 that are going to be material to our future. And if somebody had so much influence that the outcome got changed, then I want to know how to stop that.
Well, with that, I'd like to kick it out to the audience. This woman right here in the pink.
Thank you. I'm Faye Montedra. I'm an Atlantic Council member. This question is for Mr. Negroponte. The JCPOA had halted Iran's nuclear agreement, according to the international community, and the Iranians have complied to the deal, according to IAEA. My question to you is, why does the Trump administration want to halt and kill this deal and place more sanctions on Iran instead of giving new economic sanctions to Iran, which is more aligned with his campaign promises to bring more, boost the American economy, by giving more incentives to the Iranian economically. I think that would in return boost the American economy as well. Thank you.
Right. Well, you ask why are they trying to undo or get out of the deal. My impression is that notwithstanding serious reservations, they've decided that they would not withdraw from the deal. That's what I recall General Mattis saying fairly early on in the administration, saying we don't like it, but we committed to it and we're going to keep a watchful eye on implementation. I believe that's the current posture of the administration. But if you step back for a moment, I don't think it's unfair to say that essentially what Iran has done is frozen their nuclear program. They've frozen it for a period of 10 or so years, but at the same time, they've been given a free pass on their support for insurgencies and other kinds of detrimental behavior throughout the region. So, I mean, that's a sort of a broad brush way of looking at it, and I think there's concern about that second part, of what they're doing to destabilize other parts of the region, which I don't think have changed. It's the same group of people who basically, philosophically, has took over Iran in 1979.
Yes, this woman here. Please introduce yourself if you can.
Paula Stern, thank you all very much.
And affiliation.
The Atlantic Council for a long time. You don't want to know. And I'm not going to tell you even if you did. The questions that you raised and that you, Ellen, elaborated on with regard to helping those labor that has declined, dealing with inequality, the wage stagnation, et cetera. Started back, you have it in the 70s and the 80s. I guess my question that I'd like to pull out onto the table is that trust or distrust in the elite. It's not just that Congress failed, if you will, to fund enough in adjustment assistance all these years. But the business community really didn't step up. And I have a very specific question to ask you. When you do your data, maybe you have it in your footnote, that the disparity between labor and productivity output, how much of that reflects the high-paid wages in the automobile and steel industry, which started to deteriorate most dramatically when I was at the International Trade Commission in the 70s and then into the 80s. How much does that have to do with unionization in those two sectors, autos being the biggest sector?
Yeah. Well, that's a very hard question. The data is aggregate data, so we don't know, but the industrial jobs, the data on industrial jobs follows a very similar pattern. So that decoupling has been produced fundamentally by the destruction of jobs in industry, but it's now starting in services, which is what's really worrying. If you look at developments in AI, if you look at developments, particularly I think in artificial intelligence and others, and the impact they're going to have on jobs like secretarial job, travel agencies. I mentioned transportation. I think that's the next wave, and I think the change is it's going to be very, very different to the ones that we've experienced in the past, because there's a big debate in the community of economists about, well, we've lived through this in the past, and if you look at, for example, agricultural jobs in the United States from 1860 to about 1950, you had a huge collapse in the labor, in the proportion of the labor force working in agriculture. It was sort of up in the 60-something percent, and it went down to single digits. It's now under 5%, and the U.S., by the way, is a net exporter of agricultural goods. So you can imagine the explosion of productivity of the people that remain working in that sector. New jobs emerge in industry. So the question is, okay, well, now they're disappearing. Then in industry, they went down and they went up in services. The question is, what comes after services? And that's a huge question, and nobody has an answer to that. And we just don't know if the jobs that are being lost in services, we're going to have sufficient new categories emerge to fill that gap. My thesis is probably not, because the nature of the transformation is very different to previous ones. We're not substituting physical, human, or animal force, but we're substituting processing capacity, so we're substituting brains. So it's going to take us a while to come up with a completely new category of jobs that are perhaps detached from the production of goods and services. This is a huge debate. What we do know is whatever happens, we're going to have a long period of depressed employment, and we're going to have to tweak education. The question is, if we're entering a political convulsion that is a product of that breach of the social contract, how does the new equilibrium look? At least that's, for me, one of the biggest questions of political science and governments, which is, how do we come to a new equilibrium, economic and political, that is, that fulfills the requirements of equity and others? And that, we're just in the early stages of that debate. But there are clearly going to have to be major changes in the way the state procures its income, because the labor income base is going to be declining, and you're going to have a lot of concentration in capital. Changes in the way the state redistributes that income, and I don't want to sound like a socialist European, but as a social democrat, but there are issues there, and people are exploring different ways. There's a major shift, and I'll finish with this because you brought it up, the private sector. That decoupling of productivity and hourly wages makes the principle of corporations maximizing profits and growing, just having that principle insufficient, because as a social actor, if you, by growing and maximizing profits, you create a middle class because you employ people, that's a sufficient goal. The minute you stop doing that, you have a huge collective action issue, because you can have companies do very well and grow and be very profitable, but they're not creating jobs. So they start living in political environments that are very hostile, and we've seen this in Europe. And then you get people like Podemos in Spain or the Movimiento Cinque Stelle in Italy, and those people come in and they break trade deals and they tax you to death, and some of them propose the nationalization of companies. So there's a space there for a new role for the private sector that has much more social responsibility, philanthropic goals. It's a complex debate, but what we do know, and I'll finish with this, is the trends are unsustainable. Okay, if these trends continue, they're economically and politically unsustainable. At least that's my thesis. But I'm just a green card holder, so I could be deported.
So we want to get a few more questions in here, under 10. Gentleman with the blue suit in the middle. Yes.
My name is Max Trujillo. I head my own consulting firm here. I wanted to ask you, in terms of our hemispheric issues, I mean, within the 100 days, we've seen Venezuela's situation getting worse, but we don't seem to be, at least in the general information, we don't seem to be very concerned about it. Is that because we think it's a contained situation, or we are only going to pay attention to Venezuela if we see foreign actors come into play or destabilizing neighboring countries like Colombia? Thank you.
Yeah, please.
You know, I think this is a problem that's bedeviled our Venezuela policy for quite a while. I remember working for George W. Bush. His thesis was that we ought to ignore Hugo Chavez, and it basically got under his skin that we never mentioned his name. And I think that policy works and worked up to a point. I always hoped that Mr. Obama would do something a bit more visible about the situation in Venezuela, and Mr. Trump at least has met with one of the members of the opposition, if I'm not mistaken, or the wife of one of the oppositionists, and I thought that was good. I think there is this concern that if the United States leans too far forward on the Venezuela situation, it runs the risk of discrediting the efforts of other concerned countries in the hemisphere, particularly when the Secretary General of the OAS has actually been fairly active in highlighting the problems that Venezuela has. Difficulty is that meanwhile, the Venezuelan people are suffering tremendously from the just deplorable economic situation. I'm sure that sooner or later Mr. Maduro will go, but the question is at what price to the people of Venezuela?
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes.
Chia Cheng from United Daily News from Taiwan. I just want to know that we've seen Trump's attitude toward China change dramatically within the past few months. How would that change or affect the U.S.-Taiwan relations? And I don't know if you've heard that Trump said he would have to talk to Xi Jinping before he talks to Tsai Ing-wen if he has the chance to talk on the phone for a second time. How would you interpret that? Thank you.
Seems to be to you, John.
I'd say it's very consistent with American policy since the Shanghai communique. I think the fact that he received a call from Tsai Ing-wen after being elected, okay, one time, I don't think it had any particular legal impact of any kind. I think to have carried that further would have caused great concern in Beijing. I think we're back more or less on the path that 7 or 8 previous presidents have followed, which is to, we recognize that the government of Beijing and that there's one China, and that's that. And then that our relationship with Taiwan is one of secondary in a diplomatic sense, although we're guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, and we sell them equipment that's intended to help provide for their self-defense. And I think we've done that pretty faithfully.
We had another question here, yeah.
Thanks. Rod Colorina, AIAC Investment Group. I thought BuzzFeed did a good job moderating the Democrat and the Republican sort of question. And the topic that hasn't come up is the infrastructure spend. And that's about $1 trillion that's recently been blessed. Does the ambassador and the congresswoman have views on what sectors should get the most attention or what regions in that infrastructure spend?
So the administration got themselves into a sequencing problem. The reason why they had to come back so quickly after 2 failures to repeal and replace Obamacare is because they have to harvest $1 trillion of savings out of killing Obamacare in order to pass a tax cut that can be used in the budget resolution, because it has to be revenue neutral. And so that's why it's nice to know how the government actually works, because if these little things kind of trip you up. So when they couldn't get it done the first and second time, they had to come back to it because they still can't move on to what they wanted to do next, which was the tax cut, because they don't have the money to do it, and they cannot use the rules in the Senate for budget reconciliation, which means that you need 50 plus 1 votes, but it has to be budget neutral in order to do that, use that artifice. And so, I was on the Transportation and Armed Services Committee. I think, first of all, we have bridges in this country that are very dangerous, and we have to move that infrastructure. I think similar to what we did around the TARP time, shovel-ready projects, understanding. I would invest federal money only in places where states and governments are investing their own money. I wouldn't be building things that you didn't have local consensus and where there wasn't local investment. So I think, you could pretty much quickly get together and, I like Elaine Chao. I think she's going to be good in that job. And I think that getting something done for transportation is good. I also think in California, we want to use our own money to take diesel engines off Caltrain and electrify them. We think that that's going to help us keep our very aggressive and very, very good environmental goals. But right now, this is really about sequencing. What can they get done without getting the health care bill done? And they have to get it done all the way. So they have to repeal it, but they have to get it done so that it's signed, so that you can actually harvest that money and then use it. So I think the administration's in a pickle because they can't move on to the things that they want to do and things that are necessary. And frankly, what I am still stumbling about is why isn't the president talking to any Democrats? He could get Democrats, if he went to the Democrats with good faith and talked about how to work on the Obamacare bill without repealing it, because that's an artifice too, by the way, and then get it done. You can get it passed in the Senate that way. Then you can move on to the tax cut. There are Democrats that are willing to work on tax cuts, and there are Democrats that want to work on infrastructure. Right now, he's using just the Republican majority in the House to get things done, and they don't agree. And all it's really doing is showing that the Republican Party is fractured.
Did either Manuel or John have anything to add on that? Is it okay? Any more questions? Is that right? All right. Final question. Yes.
Thank you, Yulia Mendel, the communications consultant in the World Bank Ukraine, and also the researcher for the New York Times. So when Helen was talking about Russian influence into the election, possible Russian influence, you mentioned that this can be the core of American democracy. And I know that many foreign correspondents rushed to Ukraine after the elections, believing that the connection of America and Russia lies in Ukraine, is in Ukraine. And I was involved in the investigation also. So I also know that there is a kind of fatigue about my country in the world. And I wanted to hear, did you see any kind of change of attention and relations to Ukraine from the new White House administration? And how can you see the possible, development with Ukraine, talking about Russia influence and all these things? Is it clear?
I really haven't seen any enthusiasm in the White House to help the people of Ukraine deal with the Russian occupation or the seizure of Crimea or any of those issues. I haven't seen any energy at all from the White House to do those things.
Except, and it may not be sufficient, but he's certainly in that press conference with Theresa May, you may recall, when the issue of sanctions on Russia because of Ukraine came up, he said, well, that's not for now. Right. He kicked the can down the road.
And the secretary has said repeatedly that unless Minsk is fully implemented, then sanctions aren't going to be released. The Obama-era conditions on sanctions. Well, thanks so much for everyone coming out here. Some terrific questions, and thanks so much to this panelist.
Good job, John.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ellen. Good to see you.